Hello everybody, and welcome back to our series where we're looking at Auto 5's. These are the long recoil shotguns that were based on or inspired by the Browning Auto 5. Today we're taking a look at the Savage 775. It had a sister model, the 755, the difference being an aluminum receiver on the 775, a steel receiver on the 755. Now, these shotguns are generally regarded as being less desirable than Auto 5's, and we're going to go over today why people may feel that way and why I think that might not necessarily be deserved. However, before we launch into that, I would like to talk briefly about the shotgun's history, just so we can sort of understand what we're talking about here. Of course, we've talked previously about those shotguns there at the end of World War II. There was sort of an explosion of automatic shotgun development there in that peacetime period. The Savage 755 was sort of the improvement to Savage's automatic shotgun line up to that point. We haven't had videos on them specifically because they don't really add anything new to our story, but Savage had previously made the Savage 720, and the Savage 740, and the Savage 745, and the Savage 750. And these were licensed manufacturer versions of the Remington Model 11. In fact, most of the parts interchange. Really the only difference is sort of the shapes that are on the wooden pieces specifically, but otherwise it's a Model 11 clone through and through. Savage was very early interested in making aluminum receiver versions of the Auto 5, and these shotguns are generally not well regarded because the aluminum alloys they were using there before World War II even were of a quality that ended up having the receivers crack through extended use. So Savage had previous experience dealing with aluminum, but by the end of them, around the time of the 750, right, it's a true Model 11 clone just using an aluminum receiver. Those guns are generally regarded as having it figured out. However, in our previous videos, we talked about sort of the complaints that people levied against the Auto 5 were two things. It's too difficult to take apart, and that's certainly true, and Savage didn't really fix it here. But people also complained that the humpback receiver on the Auto 5 was unattractive or unsightly or ugly or made it hard to shoot for some reason. Now, Savage sort of fixed that by having the hump just be filled in by material, right? By both the stock and the receiver being extended back to meet this curve on the stock. I personally think this is much less attractive than the Auto 5, and I think that's why these shotguns sort of have a less desirable, less desirable impact on the market, right? People are less interested in these days because this is kind of a hideous way to pull off that design. However, otherwise this is still very Model 11 based with one minor tweak, right? They did begin to address the ease of disassembly by making it slightly easier to take the internals out of the gun, but only slightly so. We will delve into sort of getting into the internals. We will disassemble this as far as we had the other shotguns, just to sort of show you how awful it is to have to deal with these screws. Compared to, this shotgun came out in 1949. It was, in fact, predated by the Remington 1148. And the 1148 is hilariously easier to take apart than this, and we will showcase that to sort of help demonstrate why the Savage 755 wasn't ever particularly attractive, and while it was cheaper than most of the other long recoil offerings, it never really caught on nearly as well as they did, probably because it's kind of unattractive and it didn't really fix the difficult takedown of the Auto 5. Wrapping up on our little history discussion, the actual design for the Savage 755 was laid down prior to World War II, based on what I've been able to find. And it was actually done up as a concept gun to sort of show, like, what would an Auto 5 look like if it didn't have a hump back? And that concept gun looked more or less like this. I've seen a picture of it, but I didn't remember to save it, and hopefully I can find it and then overlay it on the video. But otherwise, just imagine a gun in black and white that has this sort of a thing going on. And while that gun didn't get manufactured at that time, it seems that Savage either bought the rights to it, if there were rights to buy, if not, just made a shotgun that looked like it, and that's what we have here, is a streamlined Auto 5. Personally, I think that just the overall height going on here is kind of unattractive, especially when you compare that side by side with something like the 1148. It manages to make things look a lot more svelte than this. With that all said, that's pretty much it for our history lesson. I'm sure Othais from CN Arsenal will eventually cover one of these and we'll be able to get into much more detail about the actual history. But Savage typically found itself at being a less desirable, less collectible, more utilitarian shotgun company, and so the history of their shotguns and really any of their offerings are not nearly as well documented as anything else, which is unfortunate, but that's going to pretty much limit our history discussion to what we've already talked about. Getting into an overall appearance of the gun, we have relatively cheap manufactured wood. Of course, this checkering looks like it was actually cut, but it wasn't cut very well. And this is, in fact, the deluxe version of this gun. And so even on the deluxe version, you have checkering that's not all that fantastic in quality. It's not very fine and it's not very straight. Was certainly done by somebody who either didn't have a lot of experience or was moving in a hurry. Now, The deluxe version of this gun really just denotes the sort of phony engraving going on here. Because this is an aluminum receiver, I think this is pressed in. It's not actually engraved. You have a jeweled bolt carrier and charging handle, sort of interesting. Shell carrier is not jeweled. And the deluxe version also got you this compensator system that was more or less based on the Cuts compensator. It's also got an adjustable choke feature out there on the end. And in the separate video where we talk about shooting it, we'll certainly get a little bit more playtime with the adjustable choke system. But for now, really the thing to know is that the adjustable choke systems on these guns were pretty fragile, more fragile than the poly choke, certainly. And if you find one of these and you're interested in purchasing it, certainly make sure that that choke system clicks and ratchets the way it's supposed to. A lot of them have the tensioning band fail, and then the ball bearings that actually give it the clickiness will fall out. And so a lot of these you'll find will just spin free on there, which certainly isn't what you want. But much besides that, in terms of overall appearance, it's really just this dehumped thing that we have going on here. And otherwise, it's all pretty much stuff that we've seen before. We've got a pair of extra screws, one on either side, and those are to hold in the pins that hold the bolt release and the shell stop on the opposite side of the gun. More or less done as a probably ease of manufacturing thing. Instead of having a threaded hole that you have to put a screw in or a tight roll pin, you can just have a pin that's a loose fit in the hole that's retained by a screw. Not a bad way to do this, and in fact we had seen Franke do a similar thing prior to this. Savage adopted that system, and that's sort of what went on here. Otherwise, pretty typical. Got our charging handle, the chunky style that the Savages and the Model 11s used, and a threaded magazine cap, which is how we begin our disassembly. Again, all stuff that we're familiar with. Go ahead and lock back our bolt, and we can remove the magazine cap by threading it off as usual. There's really nothing unique going on here with this magazine cap. This actual sort of cancellation that's done here is slightly different in how it was manufactured, but that's a very minor thing. Pulling our handguard off, we will see no metal reinforcement at all, and that is disappointing because certainly by the end of the war, everybody understood that in the long recoil guns the forend was sort of the weak link, and to have no metal reinforcement at all is certainly a eyebrow raiser. Of course, the Savages were utilitarian. They were made to be cheaper than they were to be made lasting forever. But it is a little unfortunate to see no reinforcement. I know some people will point out the fact that it's got this little strip of wood right here inside the handguard, and they'll call that a wooden elm reinforcement. Really what that was there for is that, as you can see, the sort of wood groove that sits into the front of the receiver to keep the handguard from rotating has partially cracked off on this gun. That wood strip is there to make it so that whenever that crack happens, it doesn't come all the way to the front of the handguard and continue to spread. So not quite a reinforcement, sort of just there as a kludge to make up for the fact that wood just isn't a very great material for this purpose without some other reinforcement. But that's our forend. Going past the forend, pull our barrel off the action here. Probably the most important thing to note with the barrel is that it is a two-piece solution, right? We have our barrel hoop here, which is soldered onto the barrel. This was done for cost savings. You will find some Auto 5s that had this done. Eventually the Auto 5s would switch to a forged in one unit design. Typically a less desirable thing to have it be done as two pieces, but of course that's not to say there's anything wrong with the two-piece design. Just sometimes these barrel hoops will crack off with extended use, and they will have to be reattached with silver solder. The barrel extension, really nothing new going on there other than the fact that this particular one is blued as opposed to some of the other ones left in the white or chromed. And again, out here with our choke system. It's called the Savage Super Choke. I'm not sure if this was licensed production from Cuts or what, but it is pretty much just like a Cuts compensator. A series of ribs, top and bottom on that system. And then our clicky choke out here on the end that you can adjust between extra full all the way down to slug or all the way open cylinder bore. And of course that system does work much like the poly chokes do, where it's just got a collet, a series of fingers that get tightened as you tighten down the drum on the outside. Set that to the side for now and take a look at our friction rings. We have a typical friction ring setup. In fact, Model 11 and Auto 5 friction rings can go on this gun and work. Same story with the control ring. That's all the same size, pretty much all the same dimensions. One interesting thing here is that this recoil spring is slightly shorter than your typical spring. If we compare it to the spring from an Auto 5, we'll see it's about an inch shorter. And that's not because this spring has collapsed. That's because this gun has, as far as I can tell, the reason for the difference is because this gun has the compensator system on it. because it has that compensator system, right, the gas out there at the muzzle is going to act as an additional brake. So you have the braking from the friction system and the braking from the muzzle gases, which is both going to serve to slow the barrel down. Because of that, you don't need quite as heavy a spring to get the gun to run. Some Auto 5s that would aftermarket have added some sort of compensator system would end up having people instruct you to remove the control ring entirely, just take that out of the gun, and have it just run with the standard friction piece. Their thoughts for this was, of course, because you have the extra braking from the muzzle device, the gun will short cycle if you don't reduce the effectiveness of the friction brake system. So they'll call for heavy greasing or heavy oiling, they'll call for a lightened spring or a spring that's already collapsed, and use that to make sure that the gun is still reliable. All of this said, and we'll talk about this more in the shooting segment, the combination of friction ring and spring and compensator that this gun has makes it shoot incredibly soft. In fact, it may be one of the smoothest shooting long recoil shotguns I have. And this is all on a gun that's got an aluminum receiver, right? The light and weight design of this gun would tend to make it a little bit more harsh. But all the way that things work out in its favor, this is a really, really nice shooting gun. Now, continuing on, we'll set our pieces to the side. We now have ourselves down to the action. That much of the disassembly is just like an Auto 5, and much of the rest of the disassembly will be like an Auto 5. With the exception of, we no longer have a tang on the trigger plate that connects the stock to the gun. Instead, we have a bolt up the rear end of the stock, which is sort of more traditional to us these days, but is different than how the Auto 5 did it. Sort of the advantage of this system is we can get our trigger plate off without having to remove the entire stock assembly, which is nice because having to pull a fragile piece of wood on and off of the gun every time you go to clean it is, not only is that extra work, but then it's just risking more damage to your wood. Getting the trigger group off the gun will be our next step for disassembly. We have 4 screws, 2 lock screws, and then 2 holding screws, except this isn't actually a screw. This one, like with the Model 11, is a pin that just has a screw slot on it. On a couple of these guns that I've looked at, this pin/screw gets held so tight in the gun that it really has to be hammered out extremely hard. This particular screw, I think the people who had this gun before me had sold it and said that it couldn't be disassembled and there was a screw stripped out. Well, this screw wasn't stripped out, it was just a pin, and I had to put this on my press and push it pretty darn hard with a little 3D printed tool to keep the receiver from deforming to get that pin out. I've since polished that pin down to get it so it fits correctly. I'm not sure if somebody had made like a replacement pin that was oversized or what had gone on there, but on these guns, one thing to watch out for is that if this is extremely tight, don't go thinking it's a screw, it's a pin, and it just has to be driven out either with a press or with a hammer and a punch. However, this one here in the back is an actual screw. We will go ahead, take our screwdriver, and again, on these screws, these are square ground screw heads. Don't go using a taper screwdriver in these screws because you'll just damage the screws. Of course, most screwdrivers, common screwdrivers, have a taper tip. They don't have a parallel tip. You want one that's got a parallel tip, like this is a Grace USA makes this set. There's many other gunsmith screwdriver sets. We'll go ahead and remove these 2 lock screws so that we can get the screw and then pin out for the trigger group. There's one screw there and a screw in the front. This one's fighting me just a little bit. There's our other screw. I will set these screws in 2 different locations because, of course, the lock screws, in some of these instances, the lock screw slot will point the same direction as the screw head slot. So just as an OCD thing, I like to put them back in the right place because otherwise your lock screws and your retaining screws won't face the same direction. Get my screwdriver bit for this screw. And carefully screw it out. There's our screw there. And then finally, this is not a screw, but is actually a pin. So we'll flip the gun over. Just use this piece of foam as a punch block. And tap this pin out. And again, you can see how this pin had to be polished down because it was actually like a 3 thou interference fit with the holes in the receiver, which made it extremely tight in there. I'm not sure why or how that happened, but it is at least fixed now. I don't think the gun's supposed to be that way. At this point, our trigger group, wiggle out the bottom of the gun, and with the trigger group off, we can see that this is actually a quite different design for the fire control group. We'll look at that in a little bit. I don't know that I love the way this fire control group works, but I think it is actually simplified compared to how the Auto 5 itself does it. But we'll set that to the side for now. At this point, we have our carrier assembly and its spring. That spring can just be pushed off like so. Set the spring to the side. Removal of the carrier is not strictly necessary to get the bolt out of the gun, but it does help to do so. To do that, we're back to our lock screws, one on either side. And I believe this screwdriver, yep, this is the bit for the carrier retaining screws. One on this side, and you can see it's sort of a funny shaped screw with a peg that the carrier rides on. Got one there, and then one on the other side. And now hopefully, through the process of me getting to these screws, you'll see why having two pins that pop through the gun on the 1148 and then the trigger group and carrier just come out of the gun together, that is a really, really nice thing to have that you certainly don't have otherwise with this system. And here is our carrier assembly. It's quite dirty on this one. I have shot this gun quite a bit since I've cleaned it. I might hit that with a rag here, but you can see our carrier, and then here's the dog on it. One more thing to note on our carrier, now that I've sort of got it cleaned up, is that there is generally rough machining to be found everywhere in the Savage guns. Again, because they were that budget utilitarian option, they didn't really have the polish that the Auto 5's did. Not that this really affects how they function, but they certainly cleaned it up on this side, right? This side of the part was polished. Then the inside working part of it was not polished at all. You've got tool marks all over the thing. Finally, we're about ready to take the bolt carrier out of the gun. It is easier if you pull the stock off first, and since we've got the gun taken apart this far, I will show that. However, on these guns, it is possible to get the bolt out without pulling the stock out. On actual Auto 5's, the pin that you have to remove from the bolt carrier group to get the charging handle off to let it disassemble is a taper pin that is usually very, very tight. On these guns, it is a pin that is not very tight, and so you can just pull the charging handle back to get the disassembly hole, your disassembly pin to line up with the disassembly hole, and just push it through with a punch without needing to hammer on it very hard. However, because of this, Savage didn't actually include the sort of half-moon cut that you'll see in an Auto 5 that makes it easier to get a punch on that pin, because the pin is just sort of loosely held in there. To make things a little bit easier, and to make it easier to show off to the camera especially, we will pop the stock off. And that is done through these screws on the butt plate, have to come off first. And that gets us access to the stock bolt, which isn't very far up in there, but we will use a long reach screwdriver to get to just because. And as a word to the wise, anytime you are dealing with a shotgun that has a stock bolt like this, that sort of has ears up here on the stock, it is a good idea to support the front of the stock. You can put it in a vise, of course, with soft jaws, but I already know how tight this stock bolt is on there. If it was unbelievably tight, it's a good idea to support the stock so that you're not trying to twist the stock off the action whenever you do that screw, because you can split stocks that way. But I know this one's not stuck on there because I had it off pretty recently. Get my screwdriver back in there. And bit by bit, the stock will come loose. Feels like it's free, and the stock should just pull right off of the gun. and we will see the one bit of metal reinforcement they gave the hardware, they gave the hard wood, they gave the wood on this gun, is this little ring that almost looks like a control ring for the friction ring system, but it's actually a ring that sits inside of a little notch here in the stock, and probably is just there to prevent the action from trying to split the stock in half there. Instead of that force being used to split the stock, that force is used to push this piece of steel into the stock. Not a bad design. Last thing to note here on the stock is we have our stock bolt. Of course, a long stock bolt as opposed to having a shorter stock bolt that you need a longer screwdriver to get to. I do prefer this, but there's that. A little bit rusty, but it does hold up the way it's supposed to. Set that to the side. Set our stock to the side. We've got a good pile of parts going here. And we now have our action at long last. Now, unlike the Auto 5, we don't have a cross pin so that we can take off our plug. We instead have this receiver extension set up, which really doesn't want to come apart on most guns. So my preference is to, much like the Franchi 48, pull back on the plug back here and then get the action bar lifted up. We will use a pair of tools to do this. Like so, and the action plug will rocket itself forward for us. And we can reinstall that again later on, but there's that assembly there for now. Now, with spring pressure off the bolt carrier, we can get it pulled back, and then we can align this pin with the disassembly notch, which occurs about right there. We can take our punch that we've ground a custom profile into to make it good for this job, and we should be able to get that pin at least started coming out of the gun. And at this point, just get a tool that can push the pin the rest of the way out. And with the pin removed there with the help of a pair of pliers, we have our locking block latch, which we can set to the side. Take the spring for the locking block latch out of the carrier. Get the tail of the carrier to lift up, pull the charging handle back, push the carrier forward, and take the charging handle out the ejection port. And hopefully with all of this you can see why people wished for a gun that was easier to disassemble. This is slightly easier than the Auto 5, but only slightly. It's not really much more. And of course you can see that I haven't cleaned this thing in a long time. It is quite dirty because it is a pain to take apart. Alright, and with our bolt carrier out of the gun, we only have one further step for disassembly. Ordinarily I wouldn't take this apart just for showing you guys, but there is one minor detail that is different on the inside of this bolt carrier group that I would like to show you. So we will set a couple of pieces to the side. This disassembles with one pin. On some of these guns the pin will just come out. On this particular gun the pin is quite tight. So we will get us a punch and a hammer and drive that out. And with that pin removed, the firing pin can come out the back of the bolt group, and we can take our rising block out of it there. And we have our breech block here. The machining on this is more or less just like an Auto 5. Sort of the important differences is we're single extractor on this gun. Again, that's done for cost savings, and it will sometimes cause issues on ejection with these guns because they really are meant to have that dual extractor system. But not to say that this can't be reliable, but it is just generally less reliable with the single extractor. Otherwise, the machining, all of the way things work here is just like an Auto 5. We have this rounded cut here, and that's actually what sort of acts as the equivalent of a cam path with a rounded cut here inside of the carrier. Looking at our firing pin, we actually have a square shank on the front of it, which is interesting, and a spring. A lot of Auto 5s don't have firing pin springs, and this is because ordinarily they have geometry in them so that whenever the block actually retracts, it retracts the firing pin to sort of prevent the firing pin from presenting itself before the gun is locked up. Sort of a dual outer battery and firing pin retraction system. However, on the Savage, we have a spring. Some of the Model 11s also went for this spring-based system. It's really 6 of one, half dozen of the other. However, this is actually, I had to replace this spring because the original spring of this gun had collapsed, and when those springs collapse, you can sometimes, on rare occasions, have these guns want to double, although usually it's not so much double as they can slam fire, like if you plunk one round in the chamber and then just shut the bolt, sometimes you can get them to fire inertially, right? The inertia of the firing pin can get them to fire. So it's certainly not a thing where you want to remove the spring, but the chances of you having that inertial firing is really rare because shotgun primers are pretty hard. Now, with all of these pieces out of the gun and laid out, hopefully this can sort of serve as a reference point. If you go back and watch the 1148 video, it's a whole lot easier to get this gun all the way apart in comparison. Now, the one thing we haven't talked about yet is the fire control group. We will take a look at that, sort of talk about how it works, and then we'll just sort of fast forward putting the gun back together. But I do want you guys to keep in mind that if it seems like this is a lot of complexity and a lot of fiddly parts and a lot of punches and hammers and screwdrivers and pins and screws and just a bunch of mess going on, it is. And this is something that people complained about, and it is sort of the drawback to the actual original Auto 5 design. And it's why those sort of improvements are quite nice. And probably part of the reason that I like the 1148 so much is it came awfully close to resolving all of the problems that we see laid out in front of us here. But on this fire control group, we do have an aluminum unit, and like the Auto 5, it's sort of, the Auto 5 also had a trigger plate that just had the tang for the stock to attach to. We've already discussed that, so it's not like this is revolutionary necessarily to have your fire control group be a drop out the bottom sort of part. However, what is different about this fire control group is how it works. We have a interesting slip sear system, so the trigger comes up through here, and it sort of has this arm on it, and this arm will pull down on the primary sear there and then release it whenever you pull it all the way down. So in essence, the way this works is once it's cocked, you'll pull the trigger to get the hammer to drop, but then pulling the trigger will cause the trigger to slip off of your primary sear, and your primary sear comes back to its original position to cause the hammer to come back and get cocked. And in order to pull on the primary sear again, you have to release the trigger, and it works again. This really is just a true, simple slip sear, not dissimilar to like open bolt semi-autos have very similar systems in order to make them sort of compliant, right? In order to get that really only one shot per trigger pull in this sort of a system. If you can imagine this being a dropping sear like in an open bolt, the fact that the sear snaps back to its original position is what gets you a semi-auto effect. Now that said, if you did rig this up to hammer follow, it wouldn't fire because of sort of the way that the hammer is shaped and the bolt carrier is shaped, and also how long it takes these guns to lock, and the fact that until the bolt carrier has risen, the firing pin can't come forward. These guns are resistant to being able to do that, in case anyone was wondering. But also missing on this gun is the Auto 5 has an out-of-battery safety that's omitted here because the out-of-battery safety is really redundant. It prevents you from pulling the trigger before the gun is in battery, but the gun has an out-of-battery safety built in between the firing pin and the block that prevents the gun from blowing itself up. The Auto 5 just has that out-of-battery safety as an added benefit of it won't even let you get the trigger to drop the hammer until the bolt is all the way forward. So it's not a necessary thing, just sort of an added benefit of the Auto 5. But when we're looking at these, the slip sear system here, I have had some of these guns that I've had to tinker with where this system needed adjustment. Because the sort of downside to a slip sear system is you're generally going to need a little bit of hand fitting to go on. The sear itself has an adjustment screw here in the front, which is staked in place, but of course you can undo that staking, and then it's just a set screw, a flat blade set screw there on the front, and that will actually set the ride height, sort of return height of the slip sear, or rather the primary sear, so that at the slip sear surface you can adjust, when it bites and where it resets to. And that sort of gives you adjustability, because sometimes on these guns you'll have it so the sear clicks before it actually drops the hammer, and so sometimes that will need to be adjusted. But otherwise, that's pretty much it as far as things to look at here on the fire control group. Again, the parts are all held in by cross pins, and we have a safety, and its detent is held in back here with a cross pin. It's all very simple parts going on here, and really I don't hate this design, other than the fact that it does sometimes get a little fiddly. Some guns you will have to mess with, but it is certainly a workable solution. And with our fire control group discussed, I think we are ready to bumble this gun back together. I will fast forward for that just so you guys don't have to bear through me cussing and spitting at this silly gun as I get it back together. And once we get the gun reassembled, we'll have closing thoughts with it here. And again, as a reminder, the shooting segment will be a separate video, sort of to focus the shooting on the shooting, and then the discussion and disassembly of the gun in its own video. Okay, goodness, that was a fun experience. So now, hopefully you guys can understand why, these are the tools you need to take apart a Remington 1148. Oh, and this one too. These are the tools that you need to take apart this gun. Oh, in addition to these, I used all of these tools to get this gun apart. It's a lot of tools, and certainly not something that you'd want to be able to carry around in a range bag. It's certainly possible, but lugging around, certainly this is too big of a hammer to lug around. This isn't quite enough hammer to get some of the parts of this gun apart. So it's certainly understandable why the criticism against having all of the screws and the traditional way of taking one of these guns down were levied against these guns. This is a little bit of a ridiculous system. But that discussion aside, what I would like to focus on is sort of the life, and then we talk about the life, now the death of this shotgun. Of course, Savage didn't end up making a whole lot more automatic shotguns after this one. They would end up importing some things, but I think that their production of their own shotguns more or less ended after this. The 775 and 755 were not particularly successful, as we talked about before. I think probably owing to their aesthetics and the fact that while they were a little cheaper than Remington's offerings, they weren't much cheaper than Remington's offerings. And really, given the choice between this and a Remington, I think the choice is pretty straightforward. And, for maybe 10% more price than the Savage, you could have a Browning. And at that point, I think it's pretty close to a no-brainer. The difference in fit and finish is pretty demonstrable between the Savages and the Brownings, or even the Savages and the Remingtons. So these shotguns sort of relegated themselves to that corner of the market where it was people who were buying something that they didn't really plan on having for a long time. And as a result, a lot, much like the Savage 720s and the 745s and the 750s, a lot of these that you'll find these days, the 755s and 775s, were not very well taken care of because they were sort of the cheapest shotgun that was available when they were new, as far as a reliable automatic, and they stayed the cheapest shotgun available, like pawn shop specials, a very common pawn shop special. In fact, people would try and make hog hunting guns out of them. I picked this one up. I couldn't resist it because of the price it was being sold for. For the shooting segment, we will go ahead and shoot it. It does work. It doesn't have a front sight. It was just sort of a thing that someone did to one of these guns, cut the barrel down, put an extension on it. It's a little bit of a mess. This is still the original wood furniture. They've just put some tacky black spray paint onto it. But people certainly, as far as modernized or really ruined long recoil shotguns, these are one of the more common ones you'll find because they have maintained sort of bottom of the barrel prices for much of their history. The upside to that is you can find good workable examples that may be just a little rough around the edge. You got some rust or surface finish problems or whatever, but mechanically the guns will be fine because they are still that Browning long recoil action. There's not a lot in there that can break, and the stuff that does break is springs or stuff that's easy to replace in the grand scheme of things. And spare parts can be found for these guns, and so as a result, they can end up being some of the best bang for your buck when it comes to trying to get into long recoil shotguns. They can be had, I think I paid $250 for this one and $175 for this basket case. Both of them ran fine. I didn't have to put new parts in either of these guns, but for the sort of wear items, right, the friction ring system uses regular Browning parts. For the action spring, uses regular Browning parts. There are some unique parts in the fire control group, but they're all very simple. You can find used examples, but even if you do have to fabricate them yourself, there's not very many complex parts going on. As far as the breech block parts, the extractors go, interchanges with the other Savages and with the Remingtons. So when it comes to keeping these things running, it's really not very difficult. And so they can be had relatively cheap. They're a joy to shoot. And I want that to sort of be my closing perspective of the tabletop review of them is, when it comes to getting into long recoil shotguns, this is a really good way to do it if you can get over the fact that this is kind of unattractive and they're otherwise just sort of antiquated in the same way the Browning is. And for 1949, it's understandable why people didn't want this. But these days, it's sort of a cool, interesting, cheap, unique way to get into long recoil shotguns that isn't shelling out $800 for a light 12 and pretending that you're the coolest guy on the block. Because frankly, I do think these are cooler in terms of charm than the Auto 5, just maybe not quite as good in terms of fit and finish. But when it comes to shooting them, we'll see in the shooting segment, this is a really good shooting gun, the one on top. The one on bottom, not so much, because they've kind of ruined the barrel, and it doesn't have that compensator system to help break the recoil. So this one certainly does take you for a ride, what with as small and diminutive as it is at this point. But both of them do run good, and I think that's sort of the consensus is these are a good, reliable choice. Just they didn't have much market success, and I don't think it's unfair that they didn't have much market success. It was the wrong shotgun at the wrong time, and it was kind of ugly to boot. But I do love them all the same. I think we'll leave things here for the tabletop review. I hope this has been interesting and useful to you guys. I hope any of you who are ever wondering about what these pig ugly shotguns are, you now at least have a little bit better idea. And I hope you guys will tune in to the shooting video that will be uploaded soon, and or depending on when you're watching this, it might already be available. But in that video, we'll go ahead and shoot these two guns to sort of get an idea for how they perform. But spoiler alert, it's a lot like an Auto 5, because that's what they were trying to emulate. Anyway, I've got a Patreon if you guys want to see this video or videos that aren't at all like this video where I do printed stuff or talk about gun history in general. But if you guys want to support me there, you can. It's deeply appreciated and helps me keep doing videos like this where I just talk about shotguns for extended periods of time. And you guys can go into the comments and tell me which shotgun is the best, the stupid one or the one that's also stupid, but it's actually a good kind of stupid instead of the bad kind of stupid. Which is the, you just type stupid 1 or stupid 2, and I won't tell you which is 1 and 2. There's stupid guns. Anyway, engagement bait, cool. I will see you guys next time.